They called her the Ghost, but not to her face. To her face, she was Dr. Vance, a name spoken with a barely concealed dismissiveness that hung in the frigid Alaskan air like ice crystals. She was an anomaly in this world of hardened men, a place where worth was measured in trigger pulls and miles rucked under punishing weight. Her domain was data, the silent language of numbers and patterns that governed the chaos they sought to master. She was a civilian analyst, a geophysicist seconded to the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Command on Kodiak Island, and to the SEALs who cycled through this brutal finishing school for snipers. She was little more than a curiosity, a bit of academic fluff sent from a world of sterile laboratories to observe their raw, visceral craft. They saw her parka and her data slate, not the mind that processed the world in vectors and variables. They saw a woman who studied rocks, and they laughed. The laughter had followed her from the moment she arrived. It was not loud or overt, but a quiet, corrosive thing. It was in the way Commander Thorne, the lead instructor, had looked past her during the initial briefing, his eyes scanning the faces of his trainees as if she were a piece of furniture. It was in the smirks exchanged between candidates when she knelt to examine a glacial erratic, her fingers tracing the lines of stress fractures that told a story of pressure and time. They thought she was studying geology. She was studying the physics of the battlefield. Every stone, every gust of wind, every subtle shift in barometric pressure was a variable in an equation that ended with a single, perfect shot. They saw a scientist. She was a cartographer of impossibilities. Her name was Alara Vance. She had come to Kodiak to observe the final phase of their training, a legendary trial known only as the Ghost Shot. It was a culmination of everything they had learned, a shot taken at extreme range under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. Her official purpose was to gather data for a new predictive ballistics model, a project so classified it was spoken of only in whispers by those with the clearance to do so. But her real purpose was to watch them fail. Failure was the purest data. It stripped away ego and bravado, leaving behind only the stark, unvarnished truth of a system's limitations. And the current system, she knew, was deeply, fundamentally limited. It was built on muscle memory and instinct, on generations of hard-won experience. But it was a system that treated the environment as an adversary to be conquered, not a complex web of forces to be understood. The primary source of this institutional inertia was Commander Marcus Thorne. He was a man carved from the very archetype of a SEAL operator. His face was a roadmap of deployments, his voice a blunt instrument honed by years of shouting over the din of rotor wash and firefights. He was a legend in his own right, a decorated sniper with confirmed kills that were the stuff of campfire stories at BUD/S. But time had transformed him from a practitioner into a priest. He preached the gospel of trigger time and grit, of pushing through the pain, of mastering the fundamentals until they were as natural as breathing. He saw Vance's analytical approach not just as novel, but as an insult. It was a suggestion that the art he had perfected could be reduced to an algorithm, that the warrior's intuition he so valued could be replaced by a machine. The briefing room was cold, the air thick with the smell of wet gear, gun oil, and nervous sweat. A topographical map of the target area, a desolate valley called the Widow's Maw, was projected onto a screen. Thorne stood before it, a thick pointer in his hand, tapping at the red circle that marked the objective. 2,500 meters, he announced, his voice booming in the confined space. Steel target, 12-inch plate. You will have a single 5-minute window to acquire, range, and engage. The winds in the maw are a demon. They come down from the cirque, get squeezed by the granite walls, and turn into a vortex. There is no wind flag, no spotter feedback. Just you, your rifle, and your dope. He paused, letting the weight of the challenge settle over the room of young, eager faces. These were the best of the best, the top candidates from a grueling selection process. They were confident, cocky, and desperate to prove themselves. Thorne's eyes swept the room, and then, deliberately, they landed on Vance, who sat in the back, her fingers moving silently across the surface of her data slate. The device was a piece of custom hardware, matte black and hardened against the elements, its screen displaying a swirling, multicolored overlay of atmospheric pressure gradients and thermal updrafts that she alone could fully interpret. Of course, Thorne continued, a smirk playing on his lips, we also have the benefit of modern science. The sarcasm was a physical force in the room. Dr. Vance here believes this shot isn't about instinct. It's about numbers, about geology. A few of the trainees chuckled, a low, sycophantic sound. She thinks the answer is in the rocks. He turned his full attention to her, the pointer now aimed at her like an accusation. The casual briefing had become a public confrontation. Tell us, Doctor, what do your charts say? Can these men make this shot, or does the data suggest they should all just pack up and go home? The room fell silent. Every eye was on her. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to humiliate the outsider, to put the academic in her place and reassert the primacy of his world. He expected her to stammer, to retreat into jargon, to be cowed by the sheer, unblinking hostility of 24 elite warriors. Alara Vance did not look up from her slate immediately. She let the silence stretch, a tactic she had learned from observing interrogations. Silence was a vacuum, and people, especially men like Thorne, felt an overwhelming need to fill it. She watched his posture shift, a subtle tightening in his shoulders that betrayed his impatience. Only then did she raise her head. Her eyes were a calm, neutral gray, and they met his without a flicker of fear or anger. Under the current operational doctrine and with the standard equipment, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying with perfect clarity in the still room. The probability of a first-round hit is 4.7%. That probability degrades to less than 1% with the onset of katabatic winds, which my models predict will begin within the next 90 minutes. She paused, letting her words sink in. My job is not to say if they can make the shot, Commander. My job is to analyze the physics of their failure. It was a perfect verbal parry. It was factual, devoid of emotion, and it completely sidestepped his attempt to frame it as a matter of courage or skill. She had not insulted his men. She had indicted his methods. The smirk vanished from Thorne's face, replaced by a dark flush of anger. He saw her response not as an analysis, but as a challenge to his authority, a direct contradiction of the ethos he embodied. The air in the room crackled with a new and dangerous tension. He was a man who understood direct conflict, the clean geometry of a firefight. He did not understand this quiet, intellectual warfare, and it infuriated him. Failure, he spat the word, his voice low and menacing. We don't fail, Doctor. We adapt. We overcome. Something your models can't account for. He turned back to the map, his back rigid. We move out in 30. The dismissal was absolute. The trainees shuffled their feet, the earlier amusement replaced by an awkward tension. They had witnessed a clash of worlds, and the outcome was unsettlingly unclear. As the operators filed out to prep their gear, one of them, a young petty officer named Cole, hesitated by her table. He was younger than the others, with a thoughtful, focused intensity that set him apart. He had been one of the few who hadn't smirked at Thorne's jibe. He nodded towards her slate. Katabatic winds, he said, the term sounding practiced, not foreign. The ones that flow downhill off the ice fields? Vance looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Yes, they are denser and carry more kinetic energy than standard valley winds. The models most scopes use can't properly account for their effect on Magnus lift over extreme distances. Cole absorbed this, his gaze distant for a moment as he processed the information. So, the bullet doesn't just drift. It drops and curves in a spiral. A chaotic spiral, but one governed by predictable principles of fluid dynamics, she confirmed. The problem isn't the wind, it's the failure to accurately model the system it's a part of. He nodded slowly, a look of dawning understanding on his face. He saw it. He saw the edge she was offering, the piece of the puzzle that Thorne's arrogance refused to acknowledge. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, the ma'am imbued with a genuine respect that had been absent from everyone else. He then turned and followed his comrades out into the biting cold, leaving Vance alone in the sudden quiet of the briefing room. She watched him go, a single data point of hope in a sea of institutional resistance. The first crack in the wall of dogma. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The system was about to be tested, and she would be there to record the results. The Widow's Maw was aptly named. It was a place that devoured sound and hope. A vast U-shaped valley carved by a long dead glacier, its sheer granite walls rose thousands of feet on either side, their faces scarred by millennia of ice and wind. The firing point was a small, windswept ledge on the valley's southern rim. From there, the target, a small steel plate painted a flat, non-reflective gray, was a nearly invisible speck against a scree slope on the far side. Between them lay 2.5 kilometers of turbulent, frigid air. The world was reduced to shades of gray and white. The dark, wet rock of the cliffs, the bruised purple of the sky, and the relentless, blowing snow that stung any exposed skin. Vance stood slightly apart from the main group, her body braced against a rock outcropping that offered minimal shelter from the wind. The cold was a physical presence, a weight that pressed in from all sides. It seeped through the layers of her advanced cold weather gear, a constant, draining pressure. She felt the vibration of the wind through the soles of her boots, a low-frequency hum that resonated in her bones. To the SEALs, this was simply harsh weather. To her, it was a symphony of data. She registered the shift in wind direction, the subtle drop in temperature that signaled an increase in atmospheric density, the way the snow crystals changed shape as they were driven by the gusts. All variables for her internal calculus. Thorne marshaled his team with gruff efficiency, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. He was in his element now, the master of this physical domain. He directed the setup of the primary rifle, a formidable .408 Chaytak, its heavy barrel and complex optics looking like a piece of futuristic artillery. The first shooter, a young, prodigiously talented sniper named Ramirez, settled in behind the weapon. He was the golden boy, the one who had broken every record in the earlier stages of the course. If anyone could make this shot, the conventional wisdom went, it was him. "All right, Ramirez," Thorne bellowed, his voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the valley. "Talk to me. What do you see?" "Mirage is running right to left, heavy boil," Ramirez reported, his eye pressed to the scope. Wind is... It's all over the place, Commander. I'm getting 7 miles per hour at my position, but the snow downrange is a vortex. Forget the snow, Thorne commanded, his impatience already fraying. Read the mirage. That's your truth. Give me a hold. Ramirez hesitated, his training battling with the raw, chaotic evidence before his eyes. Holding 2.5 mils left, 0.3 up for the pressure, he called out, his voice tight with concentration. Vance watched, her expression unreadable. She had her own sensor array deployed, a series of small, unobtrusive devices that fed real-time data to her slate. The screen showed a terrifyingly complex picture. The katabatic winds she had predicted were beginning to pour over the western ridge. They weren't just a current. They were a waterfall of cold, dense air, crashing into the warmer, less stable air in the valley floor. The result was not a simple crosswind, but a series of horizontal and vertical rotors, invisible, swirling columns of air that would toy with a bullet like a leaf in a storm. Ramirez's correction was a guess, an educated one based on his training, but it was like trying to shoot a fly in a hurricane with a single pellet. "Send it," Thorne ordered. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that was immediately swallowed by the vastness of the valley. The muzzle brake kicked up a cloud of snow and rock dust. Everyone watched the vapor trail, a faint wisp of white arcing across the gray expanse. For a second, it looked true. Then, about 2/3 of the way to the target, the trail seemed to hiccup, to take a sudden, violent dogleg downwards and to the right. There was no satisfying clang of impact, only the mournful howl of the wind. A miss. A clean miss. Not even close. Ramirez swore under his breath, pulling back from the scope as if it had betrayed him. Thorne's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. He refused to accept it. "You pulled it!" he yelled, the accusation unfair and desperate. "You anticipated the recoil. Get off the gun. Jensen, you're up." The second shooter, Jensen, moved into place, his movements tense. The confidence of the group was beginning to fracture. He went through the same process, but the conditions were worsening. The sky had darkened further, and the snowfall was becoming thicker, reducing visibility. He made his own calculations, adding more elevation to compensate for what he thought was Ramirez's error. He fired. The result was the same. The bullet vanished into the gray chaos, its flight path utterly defeated by the unseen forces of the atmosphere. Another failure. The crisis was no longer looming. It was present. The unmakeable shot was proving to be just that. Thorne's methodology, his entire philosophy of reading the wind through sheer force of will and experience, was being systematically dismantled by the brutal, impartial physics of the valley. He paced back and forth on the narrow ledge, his frustration radiating from him like heat. He was losing control, and worse, he was doing it in front of his men. His authority, built on a foundation of infallible expertise, was crumbling with every failed shot. "This is not happening," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He grabbed the comms unit. "Weather report, now!" The reply from the base was tinny and distorted by static. "Unforecasted microsquall, extreme pressure drop. Recommend aborting the exercise." Thorne slammed the handset back into its cradle. Abort? He would not abort. He would not be beaten by a patch of bad weather. It was a matter of pride, a battle he could not afford to lose. "One more shot," he declared, his voice raw. "Cole, get on the gun." Petty Officer Cole moved towards the rifle, his expression grim. He knew it was futile. He had listened to Vance. He understood, on some level, that this was not a problem that could be solved with more willpower. But he was a SEAL. He followed orders. As he settled behind the rifle, his eyes met Vance's across the windswept ledge. It was a fleeting glance, but it contained a silent admission. You were right. And then, as if the valley itself sought to underscore the futility of their efforts, the world dissolved. The micro-squall hit them with the force of a physical blow. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The wind shrieked, a high-pitched, terrifying sound like tearing metal. Snow swirled in a blinding whiteout, and the advanced electronic optics on the rifle began to flicker and die, overwhelmed by the sudden atmospheric interference and static electricity. The digital display on the scope glitched, showing a stream of nonsensical characters before going completely dark. They were blind. The technology had failed. The human instinct had failed. The doctrine had failed. Thorn stood frozen, a statue of impotent rage in the heart of the storm. The men huddled behind rocks, their faces numb with cold and disbelief. The mission was over. The system had broken. A profound and terrible paralysis settled over the group, a silence deeper than the roar of the wind. It was the silence of absolute failure. In that moment of collective impotence, Elara Vance moved. She did not run or shout. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and imbued with an unshakable purpose that seemed to bend the chaos around her. The storm that had paralyzed the most elite soldiers on the planet was, to her, simply a more complex set of variables. The paralysis of others was her opportunity to act. She walked past the huddled, defeated figures, her eyes not on them, but on the world around her. She was reading the storm itself, her mind processing the patterns in the swirling snow, the pitch of the wind, the subtle pressure changes against her skin. She stopped beside Cole, who was still behind the dead rifle. "Petty Officer Cole," she said, her voice cutting through the gale with impossible clarity. It was not a request, it was a command. "I need the atmospheric data from the passive sensors. Bypass the central processor. Give me the raw analog output." Thorn, jolted from his stupor by her audacity, spun around. "What in God's name are you doing, Vance? The exercise is over. We're blind." Vance did not even grant him a glance. Her entire focus was on Cole. "The system is not blind, Commander," she stated, her voice flat and cold. "You are." The insult was so direct, so clinically delivered, that it left him momentarily speechless. Authority did not need to be seized. In a vacuum, it simply flows to the point of competence. In that instant, every man on the ledge understood this. Thorn was shouting at the storm. Vance was reading its language. Cole did not hesitate. He had seen the proof of her predictions, and he had seen the failure of Thorn's dogma. He ripped a panel from the side of the targeting computer's power unit, exposing a set of raw data ports. With practiced fingers, he jacked in a bypass cable connected to Vance's slate. "I'm in, ma'am," he said, his allegiance shifting, audibly and irrevocably. "Data stream is raw, but it's live." Vance looked at the stream of numbers scrolling across her screen. It was noise to anyone else, a chaotic jumble of fluctuating pressures and temperatures. To her, it was a sheet of music. "The Venturi effect from the circ is creating harmonic resonance," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "The rotors aren't random. They're pulsing." She looked up from her slate, her gaze sweeping across the near invisible landscape. Her eyes settled on the sheer rock face to their left. "Ignore the instruments," she commanded Cole. "Watch the lichen on the western face, the dark patches. Tell me what they do." Cole, bewildered but trusting, peered through a small pair of binoculars, shielding them from the snow. "They're vibrating," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "The wind is making them flutter in a weird rhythm." "It's not a rhythm, it's a sequence," she corrected him. "It's a physical manifestation of the pressure waves moving through the valley. It's the tell." She turned away from him, and, to the utter astonishment of everyone present, she moved to the .408 rifle. She gently but firmly moved Cole aside and settled behind the weapon herself. Her movements were economical and precise, betraying a familiarity with the system that seemed impossible for a civilian academic. "What are you doing?" Thorne finally roared, finding his voice. He took a step towards her, his hand reaching out as if to physically pull her away. "Get away from that rifle. That is an order." She ignored him completely. Her hands moved over the scope's manual adjustment knobs. The electronic display was dead, but the mechanical turrets were still functional. She began to click them, not in the small, precise increments of a trained sniper, but in huge, seemingly random sweeps. She wasn't looking through the scope. Her eyes were closed. She was listening. "Ma'am, what are you doing?" Cole asked, his voice laced with a mixture of awe and terror. The other trainees had crept closer, forming a semicircle behind her, their faces pale masks in the swirling snow. They were witnessing something far outside the bounds of their training, of their entire understanding of their craft. "The storm has a heartbeat," Vance said, her voice a low, hypnotic murmur. "The pressure waves, 3 primary waves followed by a 4th, weaker echo. Between the 3rd and the echo, there's a null, a moment of relative stability, a pocket of calm that moves through the chaos." She continued to listen, her head cocked at a slight angle. "It's not long, maybe 3 seconds. The acoustic signature of the wind will change. It will drop in pitch just before it happens." She fell silent. The only sound was the shriek of the wind. Thorne stood frozen, his arms still outstretched, an effigy of obsolete authority. He had ordered her to stop, and she had acted as if he did not exist. His entire world had been inverted. The men were not looking at him. They were looking at her. She was the center of their universe. Time seemed to slow down. The howling of the wind was a constant, deafening roar. Then Vance's body tensed. A subtle change. "There," she whispered. The pitch of the wind dropped, just for a second, a barely perceptible baritone shift in the overwhelming noise. Her eyes snapped open. "Now!" She didn't seem to aim. Her finger squeezed the trigger in a single, fluid motion. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report a sharp, clean crack against the storm's fury. The recoil was immense, but she absorbed it with a practiced stillness that was utterly incongruous with her slight frame. The vapor trail was instantly ripped apart by the wind, invisible after a few feet. There was no way to track the shot. There was only the act of firing, an act of pure, impossible faith in a sea of chaos. An eternity seemed to pass in the next few seconds. The wind howled on, indifferent. The snow continued to fall. There was no confirmation, no sign of success or failure. There was only the lingering thunder of the shot and the profound ringing silence that followed in its wake. Thorne let out a short, harsh laugh, a sound of bitter relief. "You missed," he sneered. "A shot in the dark. You see, all your numbers, for nothing." And then they heard it. It was a sound that should have been impossible, a tiny, delicate note carried back across 2,500 meters of raging storm. It was faint, almost imagined, but it was unmistakably there. Ping, the sound of a .408 caliber bullet striking a 12-inch steel plate. A perfect center mass hit. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The trainees stared out into the white void, their minds struggling to reconcile the impossible sound with the reality of their senses. Cole slowly lowered his binoculars, his mouth agape. Ramirez and Jensen, the two shooters who had failed, looked at each other with expressions of pure, unadulterated awe. They had not just witnessed a great shot, they had witnessed a miracle. They had seen the laws of physics bent by a woman who seemed to understand its secret grammar. Thorne stood as if he had been turned to stone. The sound had not vindicated her. It had annihilated him. It was the death knell of his certainty, the final, irrefutable proof of his own ignorance. Everything he had built his career on, his identity, his authority, it had all been rendered meaningless by that single, impossible sound. The storm still raged, but the true chaos was now inside him. Vance herself showed no reaction. There was no triumph, no flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She simply pulled back from the rifle, her movements as calm and economical as before. She had not performed a miracle. She had solved an equation. The result was not a matter of pride, but of mathematical certainty. She picked up her data slate, its screen still displaying the flowing, complex data of the storm. To her, the mission was complete. The data had been validated. Just as the reality of the moment began to settle, a new sound intruded. The heavy, rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of an approaching helicopter. It appeared out of the whiteout like an apparition, its landing lights cutting through the swirling snow. It was a Black Hawk, painted in the subdued markings of high-level command. It did not land, but hovered low over a flat section of the ledge, its rotor wash creating a miniature, localized blizzard. A figure rappelled down with practiced ease and strode towards the stunned group. He was an older man, lean and wiry, with the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had spent a lifetime in command. He wore the insignia of a rear admiral on his collar. His face was grim, etched with the hard lines of serious responsibility. This was the observer Thorne had been so desperate to impress. The admiral's eyes, a piercing blue, swept over the scene, taking in the dead equipment, the defeated posture of the trainees, Thorne's shell-shocked expression, and finally, Vance, who stood calmly watching his approach. The admiral walked directly past Thorne, ignoring him as completely as Vance had done. He stopped in front of her, the rotor wash whipping at their parkas. He had to raise his voice to be heard over the noise of the helicopter and the storm. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that carried an immense weight of command. He paused, a flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a deep, knowing respect in his eyes. "Or should I be using your project designation? Ethel Flade?" The name fell into the silence with the force of a bomb. Cole, who was standing nearby, flinched as if he had been struck. The other trainees who heard it exchanged wide-eyed, disbelieving glances. They didn't know the specifics, but they knew the legend. Ethel Flade. It was a code name whispered in the halls of SOCOM and the Pentagon. It belonged to the Ghost, the almost mythical architect of the military's entire next-generation ballistics and environmental modeling program. The person who was single-handedly rewriting the book on long-range engagement. They had thought Ethelflade was a program, or a team of scientists, or perhaps some grizzled, retired master gunnery sergeant. They had never imagined it was the quiet woman they had dismissed as a bookish academic. the woman who studied rocks. Thorne's face, already pale with shock, seemed to collapse. He finally understood. She wasn't here to observe his program. She was here to audit it, and he had failed the test in the most spectacular way imaginable. The admiral, whose name was Hayes, turned his cold, unforgiving gaze upon Thorne. "Commander Thorne," he said, his voice dropping, all trace of warmth gone. "Your performance today has been a catastrophic failure of leadership. You valued your ego above the mission. You dismissed expert counsel that was provided for your benefit and the safety of your men. You substituted arrogance for analysis and demonstrated a profound inability to adapt to changing conditions. This is not the standard of naval special warfare." Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling what little was left of Thorne's authority. "You are relieved of all instructional duties, effective immediately," Hayes continued, his voice like cracking ice. "You will be reassigned to a staff position at Coronado, pending a full review of your command. Pack your gear. The helicopter will take you back to the main base." Thorne didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply gave a single spastic nod, his face a ruin of shame and broken pride. He turned and stumbled away towards the waiting helicopter, a man stripped of his rank, his reputation, and his very identity in the space of 10 minutes. The trainees watched him go, their expressions a mixture of pity and a dawning, terrifying respect for the woman who remained. With Thorne's departure confirmed, Admiral Hayes turned back to Vance. "I apologize for his behavior, Doctor. I had hoped he would be more receptive." "Resistance to new methodologies is a predictable variable," Vance replied, her tone neutral. "The data from his failure will be useful in calibrating the human factor models." Hayes allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Always the analyst. You're shot. The staff at the monitoring station are calling it impossible. They want to know how you did it." "The math was sound," she said simply, as if explaining a basic arithmetic problem. "I just performed the calculation." She held up her data slate. "The system worked. That's all that matters." Hayes nodded, understanding that this was all the explanation he would get. "Your work here is done, Ethelflaed. We have what we need. You've taught these men a lesson they will never forget." He looked over at the young snipers, who were now staring at Vance with an expression of profound, almost religious reverence. A lesson about where true strength comes from. The days that followed the storm were marked by a profound and palpable shift. A new order had settled over the training facility, one built not on bluster and tradition, but on a quiet, methodical pursuit of perfection. Commander Thorne was gone, a ghost of a different sort, his name spoken only in hushed, cautionary tones. The remaining instructors, men who had been complicit in their dismissal of Vance, now approached their duties with a stark and chastened humility. The laughter was gone, replaced by a focused, inquisitive silence. Vance's data slates, once ignored, became central to every briefing. Her atmospheric models were no longer suggestions. They were treated as scripture. The instructors would gather around her, pointing to topographical maps and asking questions about thermal layers and Coriolis drift, their notebooks filled with frantic scribbles as they tried to absorb a fraction of her understanding. She answered their questions with the same calm, factual precision she had always used, showing no sign of triumph or vindication. She was not a victor. She was a teacher. The victory was not hers, but the mission's. She spent most of her time with the trainees, patiently explaining the complex interplay of forces that govern their craft. She taught them to see the world not as a static backdrop for their actions, but as a dynamic, living system. She showed them how to read the stories told by the rock striations, how the angle of the sun could predict thermal updrafts, how the very silence of a landscape could be measured and interpreted. They were no longer just snipers. They were becoming applied physicists, practical geologists, masters of an art that was also a science. The most profound change was in Petty Officer Cole. He became her shadow, his earlier flicker of understanding, now a burning fire of intellectual curiosity. He did not seek to praise her for the impossible shot. He sought to understand the principles that had made it possible. One afternoon, as the low Alaskan sun cast long shadows across the snow, he found her sitting on a rock outcropping, calibrating one of her remote sensors. He approached not with a question about ballistics, but with a thermal mug of black coffee, offered in silence. She accepted it with a nod. He sat near her, pulling out a detailed geological survey map of the Widow's Maw. He didn't speak for a long time, simply studying the complex contour lines. Finally, he pointed to the cirque above the valley. "Ma'am," he began, his voice quiet and respectful. "You mentioned the Venturi effect, the compression of the airflow. I see how the rock formation creates a funnel, but how did you know it would create harmonic resonance? How did you know it would pulse?" Vance looked from the map to the distant, snow-covered peaks. "The rock isn't uniform," she explained, her finger tracing a faint line on the map that he had overlooked. "That's a band of metasedimentary schist. It's more elastic than the surrounding granite. Under the pressure of the katabatic flow, it vibrates, like a reed in a woodwind instrument. The vibration isn't strong enough to feel, but it disrupts the airflow at a regular frequency. It creates a beat in the storm." Cole stared at the map, then at the mountains, his eyes wide with a new level of perception. He was seeing it now, the hidden architecture of the world that she had always seen. It was a moment of pure epiphany. He was not just learning a new technique, he was learning a new way to see. "So the lichen," he breathed. "It wasn't just a wind indicator, it was a visual frequency meter." "Precisely," she said. That quiet exchange on the mountainside was the true climax of her time at Kodiak. It was not the humbling of Thorne or the adulation of the trainees. It was this, the successful transmission of knowledge. It was the spark of true understanding passing from one mind to another. This was the acknowledgement she valued, a silent communion of shared intellect that was worth more than any medal or commendation. It was the validation of her purpose. Her work was finished. The models had been refined with the new data. The training doctrine had been fundamentally rewritten, and a new generation of snipers had been given the tools to transcend the limitations of the past. The day of her departure was quiet and unremarkable. There was no formal ceremony, no farewell speech. The same Black Hawk that had brought Admiral Hayes arrived to take her away. As she walked across the slushy tarmac, her parka hood pulled up against the wind, Cole and the other trainees stood in a silent, informal line. They didn't salute, she was a civilian, but they stood at attention, their faces etched with a respect so profound it was almost a physical force. It was a gesture of fealty, not to a rank, but to a superior intellect, a quiet acknowledgement of the legend they had been privileged to witness. She gave them a single, small nod, then boarded the helicopter without a backward glance. The doors closed, and the aircraft lifted into the gray Alaskan sky, disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. She left as she had arrived, quietly, without fanfare. but she left behind a legacy that would echo for decades. She had come to a place of hardened men who laughed at the notion that a woman who studied rocks could teach them anything about their craft. She left a place of enlightened warriors who now understood that the greatest weapon in their arsenal was not the rifle in their hands, but the ability to understand the world in which they used it. The story of Alara Vance and the ghost shot became a foundational myth at the training center, a parable told to every new class of candidates. It was a story about the fall of arrogance and the triumph of intellect, a lesson that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the wisest. They spoke of her not as a person, but as a force of nature, a quiet professional whose competence was so absolute that it had reshaped their reality. She remained a ghost, an enigma known only by a code name, her true contribution buried under layers of classification. But for the few who were there on that mountain, who heard that impossible sound cut through the storm, she was the architect of a new age, a lonely, brilliant mind who saw the universe not as a thing of chaos, but as a problem waiting to be solved. And in the silence she left behind, they learned to listen for the heartbeat of the storm.